The impacts of climate change are felt very severely here in the Continental Divide between BC and Alberta. And we'll learn more about that from glaciologist and world-renowned climate change expert Bob Sandford when we talk to him in just a few moments. We'll also get Bob's take on what the impacts are for our water and our climate and our living conditions in Ontario. So we'll look forward to that talk.
So Bob, since 2013 when you came to talk to our group about the impacts and the threats to fresh water in Ontario, we've learned a lot. In 2015, what's important for us to know about what's happening to our climate and our water resources in Ontario in particular?
I think in Ontario in particular, it's important to understand that hydroclimatic change is continuing to advance, and that the standards and the parameters that we have been using to manage water resources in the past are going to need to respond to those kinds of changes. And we're seeing this widely, and so consequently good management now will allow you to be more resilient in the future.
Excellent, yeah. So changes in Ontario have been not that evident in recent years. The temperatures have been temperate, and we've had long, cold winters. Is climate change really going to be a problem for us in Ontario? I think a lot of people are just wondering.
Well, I think it's very interesting. A lot of people say, well, it's been cold this winter, so how could there be any evidence of climate change? But what you see when you look very carefully at what happened to Ontario is that you saw once again the jet stream parking over part of Ontario at least, and certainly over much of Atlantic Canada. And when I looked this year in February at the global temperature variation map, there were warming areas widely in the northern hemisphere, and this huge blue blob around southern Ontario and Atlantic Canada where it was cold, and also in Atlantic Canada where there are heavy snowfalls. Now, it's very important to recognize that there is natural variability, and we will be responding to that always, but what you see is added to that are the effects of warming. Now, one thing that has been good in Ontario is heavier snowfall, so you've seen the Great Lakes and other lakes levels rising, but what you also are starting to see is what happens elsewhere in the country. In Ontario, I have bad news for you. Ontario is not the center of the universe.
I understand.
But what we had this year was very interesting. While you were having those conditions in Ontario, we had very low snowfall in the west. Much of the precipitation fell as rain instead of snow. As a result of that, the snowpack was small and also started to melt earlier. Our peak stream flows were a month earlier. And at the end of June, we faced drought conditions from Vancouver Island to the Manitoba border and from Mexico to the Arctic. And that is extraordinary, to say the very least.
I understand. What are we going to do? This is obviously something that we may have been spared in the short term in Ontario, but what is it we need to do, and who's going to help us make the changes to adapt and make sure that we're ready for what seems to be a very dramatically changing climate?
Well, I think the first thing that has to be done here is that individuals have to take responsibility for protecting their own properties, their own security, their own families, and that's not just with cottages, that's generally. People have to see that they have a responsibility for making sure that they do everything they can to make sure that extreme weather events don't cause damage to their homes or threaten their safety.
Right.
We also have to recognize that these changes are going to accelerate in the future, and that we're going to need better policies, better cooperation with one another, more engagement between governments, the private sector, and the public in terms of understanding how we work together to deal with these problems. And water is probably the very best vehicle to use in terms of managing that effectively as a precondition for real sustainability.